Hi, I'm Tyrelle Cannon, here with Nerd Brew's Artist Corner. Welcome to my studio. I'm a comic artist based in Chicago. I do comics and illustration of all kinds, self-published work, and work for clients. This is my drawing table where I spend the most of my time. I do pencil and ink traditionally for the most part on my work. There are some digital components like the color and the thumbnailing process. So I also have my computer set up over here. Usually this is playing, movies and podcasts while I work, so that's the other thing that I use it for. I do use an iPad, really cool tool. A lot of people resist it when they're traditional like this, but I have learned to accept its powerful tool set. I also have all my back catalog here for fulfilling orders. I have done comics such as Victus, which is a black and white science fiction comic about human relationships. This is the 4th issue. And then more recently, I've done Eris, which is another science fiction comic based in a far, far away future. I co-wrote this with my brother Logan. It's got a lot of violence, action, things like that in it. We recently kickstarted this, and I'm working on the 2nd issue right now. I also did, during the month of October, this last year, I did an Inktober called IDKFA, based on the video game Doom, of which I am a huge fan of. But I like to have all this stuff on hand so that when people do make orders, they can get it right away. Also, I reference it a lot when you're drawing the 2nd issue of a comic. It's nice to have that first one that you can look at. Over here is my wife's studio. She's a jeweler. Titan Jewelry is her company's name. She does custom jewelry, engagement rings, wedding rings, things like that. She's also a CAD designer. And then this is my reference library. So I've got Blu-rays and DVDs and books. I look at this stuff all the time because when you're stuck by yourself trying to create things, it's a big challenge is just staying, inspired and finding things that are going to help you to, refine your process even more. So I'm constantly pulling things off the shelf around here. For example, there's this Mobius series that I have of different Mobius drawings. He's a huge influence on me. Lately, for my science fiction work, I've been looking a lot at Beksinski. He's this insane painter that did all these sort of nightmarish images. Really cool reference point for backgrounds and things of that sort. Another huge influence on me is Jack Kirby. A while ago, some of my friends got me this artist edition of the New Gods, which, if you've never read the New Gods, in my opinion, it's the best Jack Kirby book. But looking through the artist edition is really cool because you can see what the original pages look like. You can see some of the ink marks. You can see when they did paste downs. You can see notes in the margins. But Kirby has a great energy to his action scenes and to his designs. So this is one that I pull out constantly, even though it's kind of big. And then here's another one that is a huge influence on my current work. So Legend, I guess this is the whole collection, so the complete series of Luther Strode by Tradd Moore and Justin Jordan. This is one of the greatest action comics ever made. Tradd Moore is really just an amazing artist that pushes what can be done in comics as far as action scenes go. So this is one that I look at all the time. But again, it's really nice to have just work available to look at. I'll pull out a lot of my friends' work sometimes. I'll pull out things that I haven't looked at in a while and see if I can incorporate some of those elements into my work. So after this, I think that I would love it if you guys could come and join me at my studio and check out the whole process of how I draw comics. So I'm just doing some thumbnails right now. I started doing my thumbnails on the iPad maybe 2 years ago. Before that, what I was doing is I would make little tiny books that were like maybe a little bit smaller than the final comic, and I would do all the thumbnailing there. And then I would bring that into Photoshop. I would scan those, and then I could make adjustments on the sizes and get everything where I wanted it. And then I would print that up and then lightbox it onto my final paper. So it was pretty laborious, but the results were good. But with the iPad, what's nice is I can do kind of the whole thumbnailing process and all the adjustments all in one place. And then when I print it up, I can print it with Blue Line, which is sort of like a method where when the final drawing is done, the blue lines from the printer won't show up in Photoshop after you make a couple adjustments. So it's pretty nice. One of the nice things about working digitally for the thumbnails is, for me, is two things. One is that one of the big things you're trying to do, which you can kind of see on this page, is get figures to kind of be in space in the correct way. And so if you can just take them and select them and then kind of fucking move them around and stuff like that, if you can take them and move them around like that, I'll say it once without swearing, it's kind of helpful to do that. The other thing that I use it for, like tons, is things like perspective grids. You can lay in your perspective grids and then kind of get your buildings and things like that. And doing that on paper, you know, it's not impossible, but it's a lot easier to do it digitally. Right now, I am trying to make an adjustment to one of the figures for Beef Bros. So I do, like, I call them my thumbnails, but they're kind of more like rough pencils at the end of the day, because I do get kind of detailed with some of the faces and things if I feel struck to do so. But this is the most challenging part of making comics for me, is like the phase where you're figuring out panel arrangements and figure placements and the storytelling aspects. Once you have that stuff done, the rest of it is a lot more fun and feels a little more natural to me. And maybe part of that's just because I'm working on paper for the rest of the aspects of it. So I try to do things in, you know, chunks, but that's never quite how it works out. So here's an example. Like, I got to draw these effects, which this is something I'll definitely probably figure out more on paper, but it's like, how do you make something feel like an impact of electricity, you know, on a still piece, you know, of paper. Obviously colors will help, but if you don't have it there in the line art, no amount of good colorist, you know, work can make it happen. On Beef Bros, we're working with this colorist Fico Ocio, or Ocio, I'm not sure exactly how you say it, but his stuff is bananas. My wife describes it as Lisa Frank on acid, which is like a cool aesthetic that he has going on. So everything's really bright, there's a lot of color holds. It's really fun to see these pages come back in color. Okay, this is about there. And at this stage is where, you know, I'll usually make sure the balloon placements work good so that I'm not covering up any critical artwork spots. And then we take it into the computer and print it up for penciling to start. Once I finish with iPad kind of thumbnail stuff, I'll print up the pages, which is just like my printer. And what I do is I print them in a blue ink. It's really cool because what you do is then the blue ink's there as like a guide for when you're penciling. But once you get the final artwork finished and you're ready to scan it back in, you can take the blue out really simply in a program like Photoshop or you know, Clip Studio, whatever you're using. So that's where I'm at now. So I'm working on some different pages here than I was earlier. Some more Beef Bros stuff. Here's a Beef Bros page I just printed up. It's a good flexing page. So these guys are huge bodybuilder dudes. They definitely are in the sort of vein of like pro wrestling or you know, beat 'em up video games like Street Fighter and Double Dragon, Final Fight. So you want them to feel larger than life. There's a lot of different ways to approach sort of muscled characters. It seems like it's, you know, I think a lot of people might look at superhero comics and see them as sort of samey for that reason. But there's a million different ways to approach something like a muscled character and how they move and how they're proportioned. I tend to go slightly more, this is going to sound weird, but slightly more realistic with some of the proportions. So I don't have like super tiny heads and super giant biceps when you look at them in proportion, even though they will be very big. I try to focus on things like the style of their body too. So for example, this guy, Ajax, he's a little bit shorter, a little bit stockier, more of like a Franco Columbo kind of a guy, whereas Huey, his beef brother, he is still muscular, but maybe slightly taller, has maybe a little more of a leaner build, more of like an athlete, whereas Ajax, I tend to look a little more at like power lifters and bodybuilders for his physique. I mean, they both, it's subtle. I mean, I don't think that people are gonna see that as like a huge change, but it's another thing I do in my comic Eris. Each one of the characters in Eris has a different build depending on sort of their fighting style and what their special abilities are. I've always thought that if you're looking at, say, a classic comic like X-Men, Gambit shouldn't be muscular in the same way that Wolverine is. You know, Wolverine's like 5 foot, you know, Gambit's like 6'1" and he's agile. And so you want to try to draw them differently because it's another way to express characterizations. If you just draw everybody the same and then you just change their haircut, I think that's, you know, doing a disservice to what you can do when you're creating these things whole cloth. I mean, you're not using actors, so you're not beholden to like specifically human proportions, or specifically like, oh, this actor's only 5 feet tall, so we have to use, you know, X, Y, and Z to tell his story. So it's kind of a fun challenge, and it makes it a little more interesting. But again, getting the layout down in the iPad on this page makes it so like right now I can really just focus on the shapes and the overlapping musculatures and getting sort of the general muscles in the right place, and then adding, you know, I guess what I call kind of flavor, like how can I make this line or that line like have some energy to it. Because it's one thing to draw like a perfect figure who's the right size and they have the right pose and everything, but you know, there's 100 people who can do that. You know, you've got to find a way to sort of make it yours and see those elements that, you know, those elements that are more you, that no one else is seeing. So again, it's that whole conversation between your brain and your hand, and you know, you'll see something and then you'll think of something else and from your visual library and sort of factor that in. Beef Bros was kickstarted late 2020. Aubrey Sitterson and I are co-creators. Aubrey came to me with the germ of an idea for these bodybuilder superheroes called the Beef Bros, fighting for more the common person's needs. You know, we were thinking, well, this should be something we do on our own. You know, we should own this and we should make it happen. And so we decided Kickstarter was the way to go. And then we did the Kickstarter, and it was successfully funded. We went over our goal by quite a bit, so we were able to, you know, give some other upgrades to people and get started on the second issue. So I'm going to jump to inks for a minute just to show you guys some of that. With a lot of stuff where you're working with collaborators, it's nice to show the pencils before you put the inks down, just in case there's any adjustments to be made. Aubrey's pretty great about letting me do what I want, but we're not going to ink any Beef Bros because we want to make sure Aubrey sees those first. But I have the second issue of Eris here, which is at the pencil stage and ready for some inks. When I do my own work, I do jump around a lot between pencils and inks. I'll jump around all over the page. I think it's mostly because I get bored. Also, there's just parts of the drawing maybe you're more excited about. There's also parts you're not wanting to draw. So sometimes it's nice if you can just say, well, I'll get to that later when I'm feeling it more. So we're going to do a little bit of inking. Now with inks, you want to be aware of where you're at. I'm sure at some point here I will drag my hand through the ink. It happens almost every time. It's good to have a blotter paper, something you can kind of make sure the brush is flowing correctly. That being said, this is my favorite part of the process. I absolutely love putting ink down on the paper. Powerful hands is another thing that I want people to see in my work. I think that there's this maybe history in comics of these little gummy, little squarey, terrible looking hands, and I want the hands to feel substantial. But with inking, it's scary because it is the, you know, not that you're ever, I mean, you can always put some whiteout back down on it, which I do often, but it's also really fun because, again, you're kind of waiting to see what happens when that brush hits. And when you're using things like brushes instead of, say, the iPad pencil or tech pens all the time, there's a little more chance for different things to happen when the brush is on the paper instead of having it do exactly what you want all the time. And like letting go of some of that control, I think has been a huge challenge for me, but also like one of the things that's helped my work to get better. To not think that I know exactly where every line's gonna go, but to sort of like be a little more open to where that line might end up. And at this stage is also where I kind of, it's hard to describe, but after you've been doing something for a long time, like drawing. There's just certain things you just sort of intuitively know. So, you know, you can look at it and kind of say like, oh, this needs a line here. And sometimes it's really hard to describe where that intuition comes from, but I try to be good about it because I know a lot of people, like I've had a lot of interns in the past that, you know, they want to learn. And so if I just do it and don't really explain how it's happening, that's not helpful. But sometimes it's very difficult. Like I don't know why that line needs to be there, but it definitely needs to be there. You know, it's something about it is showing a little more of that tension in his shoulders, a little more of the pullback of his arm. Because you know, there's this idea that there's a correct way to render certain things, but if you look at any comic and you're actually looking at it with, say, like a filmmaker's eye, you're going to see that their lighting is completely fictitious. You know, it's like people always talk about establishing their light sources, and I think that's a good thing to think about. But at the end of the day, it just needs to look cool. Like it just needs to look cool. Like it doesn't have to be, quote, right all the time. It just has to look awesome. And if there's a way you can do that with, you know, a cool shading technique that maybe isn't 100%, you know, local lighting or you know, lit in the way that is realistic, it doesn't matter as much. All right. So thanks for joining me in my studio today, listening to me talk about comics. My name is Tyrelle Cannon again, here with Nerd Brew. You can check out my comics online, on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter. I am at @TCannonComics. My website is tyrellcannon.com. You can pick up my past work there. And coming up soon, you'll be able to get your hands on Beef Bros #1 and Eris #1. It's been really nice having you in my studio.